Hey, and welcome to my Diablo 3 Hammerdin guide. This is what I hope is going to be the first in a series of Diablo 3 guides, although given that this is just a hobby, we'll see how many I actually end up making. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about the standard gear and skill choices, because you can find that on Riker, on Icy Veins, whatever. I want to focus on some things that other guides normally don't touch on. So first off, I'm a hardcore player, as you can see. Basically, no one else who makes guides seems to be a hardcore player, so I have a lot of trouble finding what I should and shouldn't do when I'm making a hardcore version of a guide. So hopefully for those of you who play hardcore, maybe you're just interested in hardcore or just want to play softcore but die a little bit less often, we'll find some helpful tips in some of these guides that you wouldn't otherwise see in the usual guides. Now, another thing I want to focus on is what you might do differently from the guides if you aren't interested in being number one on the leaderboards, because for whatever reason, most of these guides are written with the goal of being a number one on the leaderboards. Now, the third thing that you'll notice, which I guess I didn't really think of when I was first reading the guides, but is surprisingly missing, is that no one really actually tells you how to play the build. They show you the gear, they show you the skills, they maybe show you some follower stuff or whatever, but when it comes right down to it, they don't tell you how to actually use your abilities, and sometimes it's not quite that obvious. There are little things you maybe realize after a day or a week or a month of playing, which like drastically improves your ability to actually play it. And it'd be nice if we had those things in advance. Now, finally, pretty much everyone who makes guides, and I'm guilty of this as well, has a huge amount of Paragon, they've got pretty good gear, they've got all this kind of stuff that you might not have. So what I hope to do is at the very least show you what you actually might want to do if you don't have all of this Paragon, if you don't have all of this gear, etc. And uh, even though a lot of these guides give you, oh, maybe you should take area damage first and then you should take light per hit second. As far as I could tell, these guides aren't really trying to tell you, oh, area damage is the most important thing. This is actually the first thing you should take. They're kind of looking at it and going, what do I think is the best one of these abilities when I'm pushing GR 100 with perfect gear? Area damage. So I guess I'll put that as the number one priority, which is strange, but seems to be how it works. So anyways, let's get in. Now, if you don't already do this, I recommend you play in Act 1 because it just makes Kidal a lot nicer. Puts everything in very close together, unlike Act 4 or Act 5 where you have to do a lot of running around. So anyways, here we are. Alright, so my gear is quite good. It's all good ancient pieces. I've been playing way too much this season. I don't want to focus on that too much. I'll leave a D3 planner link in the video description if you're really interested in seeing it, but it's not too important. You can see that on Icy Veins or wherever. Now, one thing I don't want you to focus on too much is the GR levels that I'm actually going to be doing in here because my gear is probably better than yours, my Paragon's probably higher than yours, my gems are probably higher leveled than yours, so on and so forth. Instead, I want you to look at when I actually get to doing the Rift, how it looks like it's feeling for me, and maybe if you don't have the Paragon I have, you can do the same thing 5 GR levels lower. Maybe if all of your gear is non-ancient, maybe you drop 5 or 10 GRs, whatever. The point is, the exact GR numbers are going to depend on exactly what your gear looks like, exactly what your Paragon looks like, and so on and so forth. That's not too important. What I just kind of want to look at is doing GRs at a level which is not quite farming territory, but at the same time isn't bleeding edge leaderboard pushing 15-minute runs. Now, a few things I do want to highlight with my gear, or with any gear decisions you might want to make. This is all a pretty standard Hammerdin setup. There's not a lot of flexibility with this build. The changes that you can make are Gabriel's Van Braces you're absolutely going to want if you're doing harder content, but if you're doing really easy farming content, you just want to clear the rift faster, I recommend swapping them out for Nemesis Bracers. If you're having a lot of trouble staying alive, you can swap Convention of Elements for Unity. I wouldn't really recommend it. I would recommend just getting more used to staying alive with the build, honestly, because you lose a lot of damage if you drop Convention of Elements, but it's an option. Sacred Harness is nice, and it gives you a lot more survivability than you would think, but if you really want, you can, or if you just don't have one, you can drop it for something else. And when you're getting set up with the gear in the first place, when you're first maybe just started the season, you don't have everything yet, you got 500 blood shards, you want to know what you should be spending them on, I recommend you start by trying to get at least one of the Guard of Johanna and Johanna's Argument, and one of Faithful Memory or Hammer Jammers for your cube. At that point, your build is pretty much online. Now, every extra item you get is, of course, going to give you a pretty significant power spike, but that should be enough to get you started farming, and more or less put you in the clear, doing content that's high enough level that you don't feel like you're not making any progress. Now, the one thing that is really worth focusing on is gems. The first two are pretty standard. I've got a Gogok with Swiftness and a Bane of the Trapped. Bane of the Trapped is in pretty much every build these days because it's just incredibly good. It gives you a significant survivability bonus by slowing people down. It gives you a huge damage bonus, and it actually procs its own damage bonus. You don't actually need to use anything to get that bonus. Gogok with Swiftness is pretty much mandatory for this specific build. It gives you bonus survivability, which is nice, bonus attack speed, which gives you better damage, and most importantly, it's going to give you a really significant cooldown reduction bonus. Now, finally, if you look at builds on the internet, they're all going to say Bane of the Stricken. Most builds will say Bane of the Stricken, but definitely this one will. And you'll notice that I don't have a Bane of the Stricken here. If you really start pushing your GRs, maybe you're getting to GR 90, GR 100, whatever, it depends on your gear, and you're going to 14 minutes, 13 minutes, you're going to notice the Rift Guardian starts taking 2, maybe 3 minutes to kill, which is really long. And that's at the point where these effects you get from Bane of the Stricken right here start being really relevant. The 25% damage is of course nice, but more importantly, you're going to be hitting this guy hundreds of times. So the fact that you're doing 2% more damage every single time you hit him makes a huge difference in how quickly it goes down. However, we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be running rifts in maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes. The Rift Guardian's not going to take more than 30 seconds to kill. There's no point putting in a gem that's just going to make it take 28 seconds to kill instead. So I've picked Bane of the Powerful because it's the next best damage gem for this build. If you would like survivability instead, you got a few options. You could take Esoteric Alteration, of course. You could take Mutilation Guard. Maybe you could take Molten Wildebeest Gizzard if you really like it for some reason. I don't know if I'd recommend it for this build, but it's an option. But just don't take Bane of the Stricken. You'll know when you need it. Probably by the time you actually need Bane of the Stricken, you know you need Bane of the Stricken. You don't need a guide to tell it to you. Okay, as for skills, my skills are pretty standard. Akaraz Champion is mandatory for pretty much any Crusader build under the sun. It's just a massive survivability bonus, and it gives you some damage as well. Blessed Hammer is, of course, what this build is. Iron Skin, some people run Flash. I really wouldn't recommend it. It's going to make it a lot harder to keep Iron Skin up, and you don't really need the extra mobility, but you can try it, and if you like it, you can keep it. Provoke is absolutely mandatory. You're not going to have any wrath without it. Falling Sword, of course, procs basically everything you do. Laws of Valor, some people will run Unstoppable Force. Once again, I wouldn't recommend it. It's kind of a crutch. You shouldn't need it to keep your wrath up, and at the long run, you're going to be wanting to use critical anyways for the bonus damage, so practice the critical. If you're having troubles managing your wrath, just try and figure out what the problem is and do it better rather than just giving yourself some resource cost reduction that you really don't need. For passives, Fervor, Holy Cause, and Finery are completely standard. Some softcore players like to run Blunt instead of Indestructible. Now, of course, if you're playing hardcore, Indestructible is mandatory. It's like if you want your character to live for longer than 5 minutes. If you're playing softcore, Indestructible I would still really recommend for this build. This build you're going to find is made of wet tissue paper. It's not going to survive very long. Sometimes you just make a stupid mistake and you proc instantly. It's 20% damage bonus on Blessed Hammer damage is not as much as you'd think, especially since you've already got a bunch from your gear. It's really nice to have that second chance. And once again, for hardcore, it's just completely mandatory. Now, you don't have a lot of flexibility. Some builds, there'll be a skill that you don't really need, but it's just kind of nice to have. This one's not like that. But if you're going down to speed farming content, where you just want to blast through, let's say, T13 Rift as quickly as possible, the content's easy, you kill everything in 1 or 2 shots, you can swap out Iron Skin for Steed Charge with the Endurance Rune. Falling Sword is really not that great for mobility. Steed Charge will be much better. And then you can swap out Laws of Valor for Laws of Hope with the Wings of Angels rune. Gives you a nice party-wide movement speed buff, and the shield is pretty convenient as well. Okay, so the last gear thing to be said is the Follower. The Follower is pretty much completely up to you. I use a Templar. Of course, the invulnerability relic is mandatory if you want him to be alive ever. Oculus Ring is also basically mandatory. It's the best ring in the game for followers. Other than that, it's pretty much just whatever you'd like. I've got a Unity on him just because I use Unity on my other builds, and I'm too lazy to change my follower between builds because it really doesn't matter. But if you want to be totally optimal, you should probably be using Weird Ward here and Thunder Fury in his weapon slot. S of Johann is a nice amulet. Some people don't like it. Do what you feel. I use the Templar because I really like all of his healing abilities. Some people don't. Some people prefer to run Enchantress or Scoundrel. Once again, you do you. The follower makes a tiny difference. People really overstress its importance. Just whatever makes you happy will honestly make a bigger difference than whatever bonuses the follower is actually giving you. Okay, let's talk the actual build strategy. So, the most important skill in this build is Falling Sword. You've got a bunch of different things that require Falling Sword to proc. First off, you'll see in your set bonus, for the 4 set, you take half damage when Falling Sword has just been cast recently. Also, you'll see in your cube, enemies which have just been blinded, immobilized, or stunned, and by the way, Falling Sword does that, take 5 times damage. Falling Sword is mandatory, you're going to want to be spamming it. And finally, every enemy you hit with Falling Sword increases your damage by 80% for 10 seconds. It stacks up to 10 times. The difference between having Faithful Memory and Hammerjammers active and not having them active is a 45 times damage multiplier. That's equivalent to about 25 GR levels. So that is an absolutely massive difference. One of the most important things you can learn with this build is how to keep your Falling Sword active at all times and how to maximize the value you get out of your Hammerjammers and your Faithful Memory. Other than that, just like any other Crusader build, Akarat's Champion is 100% mandatory. You want to keep it up as often as possible. If this thing goes down, you're going to die in 1 or 2 hits. It's really bad. As you can see, my toughness is 22 million. That's pretty much a one-shot kill on Torment 13 even. Whereas if I hit Akarat's Champion and then I hit my Falling Sword buff, we go up to 100 million, which is not great, but it's a lot better. This build really is going to rely on you spamming hammers at all times and getting these life per wrath spent procs from your weapon and shield to actually stay alive. Provoke is also mandatory. You're going to be spamming it 100% of the time. This thing is going to keep your wrath at a reasonable level. Iron Skin and Laws of Valor are really counterintuitive. People want to be casting these things as much as possible because great, Iron Skin gives you double toughness, Laws of Valor gives you a big damage boost. Why not, right? But the problem is we are relying on Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac to keep Akarat's Champion up. If you cast these spells too often, you're dropping your Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac procs. You'll also slow down the cooldown and provoke a little bit, but that's not a big deal because you've got this 2-set bonus right here. But the point is, only use this guy if you're about to die, or if you feel like you're about to take a lot of damage, and only use this one if you really need an extra damage for some reason. At lower levels, I would pretty much say if you run into an elite that's got a lot of health, like a Juggernaut or something, or if you run into the Rift Guardian, you probably want to be casting the Laws of Valor. Once you start pushing, and once you start wanting to optimize, you want to be syncing up your Laws of Valor with your Convention of Elements rotation to do maximum damage. All right, that's about it. The usual hardcore advice applies. If you proc Indestructible at any time, just get out of the Rift. Once you're pushing and once you're getting around 14-minute clear times, you need to stop doing this, which gets really awkward. But if you're running a 5-minute Rift, it's really not worth trying to save 45 seconds and then dying. Just get out of there. On the other hand, if you proc Akarat's Champion, honestly, I pretty much just use this thing as a healing potion, especially if it's about to cool down. Don't worry too much about it. This thing is just going to happen constantly. The cooldown is like 15 to 20 seconds. Don't worry too much about it. So anyhow, without further ado, let's run some rifts. I'm playing as I talk, and I'm not the best at playing as I talk, but I'll try and throw in some commentary and tell you what's going on. So I'm going to start at GR 70. This is pretty decent farming territory for me. It's a little bit sketchy. I am going to be taking a lot of damage, but it's fairly comfortable. I don't have to think too much when I'm playing the build. So this is around where I would normally aim to be farming in hardcore once you get comfortable with the build. So you can see the provoke is cooling down really fast. So we can keep our wrath quite nice. Just make sure you're keeping your Gogok up at all times. That's a big cooldown bonus. And you're casting Provoke whenever you run out of Wrath. At first, you might have to think a decent amount about when to actually cast Falling Sword. Once you do it a little bit, you just get the hang of casting at the right times. Here I'm trying to cast it about every 8 seconds, but then I'll also recast it if, for example, I just wanted to proc Hammer Jammers on these guys. And I'm not going to cast it if there's no enemies nearby. Now you'll notice Akarat's Champion drop for a second. That will happen occasionally, and you notice how quickly I took damage when that happened, which is why you really want to avoid this. I'm not going to bother casting Falling Sword here. This is just trash. It's not worth killing. Okay, yeah, don't get too hung up killing stragglers. They don't give you very much progress. You don't do a great job of killing them with this build. You're going to want to look for some density, like here. That being said, keep in mind, even if you're not trying to kill anything, you really do need to be hitting someone every 4 seconds. This Gogok is very, very, very important to keep your buffs up. So even if you're just walking past people, just sling a hammer every now and then. I assume this goes without saying, but just make sure that you do not stand in molten explosions. They will proc you instantly at any reasonable difficulty level. Now you'll notice that I actually haven't had to cast Iron Skin a single time in this rift. I might have cast it once by accident, but it really hasn't been necessary. It's nice to have if things get really sketchy, if you're standing in arcanes or something, but it's not as necessary as it feels like it ought to be. Once again, I'm not going to cast Falling Sword here. I don't plan to engage. Not enough enemies. Notice just how quickly those elites go down if you've got Hammer Jammers and Falling Sword on them. If I just had the Falling Sword but not the Hammer Jammers, it would have taken about 5 times as long to kill, so you really want to hit with both if you can. Honestly, at this point, there's not a lot left to say about this run. It's pretty straightforward from here on out. I would guess if you're in a situation where you maybe don't have very many Ancients, you are at like 700 Paragon, you might want to be running, I don't know, GR55, GR60 at about this level. Honestly, you don't have to go all that much lower. Just takes a little bit of practice. One of the annoying things is you will often lose your Gogok stacks when you do it at a level like I just did. There's not much you can do about it. Now in that case, I needed to cast Falling Sword just to get in there and to get my defensive buff, but I didn't hit a lot of people with it. So I just recast it to get a much better Hammer Jammers and Faithful Memory proc, and because it was cooling down anyways. Pylons are nice to have, but they don't make a huge difference. Conduit and Power are really important. The other three are not a big deal. One annoying thing with Rift Guardians is when they're spawning in but not targetable yet, you won't actually proc either of the Faithful Memory buffs, either the Faithful Memory buff or the Hammer Jammers buff, so just wait a second, wait until you can target them. Anyways, there's a GR70. Alright, let's just level some random gems. I'm using low-level gems, as you probably saw here. I didn't want to use my level 100 gems in a level 70 GR tutorial, especially because I've never pushed anywhere near that high with this build. Okay, the last thing I promised you, which I forgot to do earlier, and I'll do right now, is a little bit of a word on Paragon points. Now, as you can see, I've got a ridiculous amount of Paragon, so I've just maxed out everything. However, if you're in a situation where you maybe have, I don't know, 400, 500 Paragon, you got to be a little bit more choosy. What do we want to do? Okay, so of course, movement speed is always mandatory. Other than that, for now, you can afford to put everything into strength. Maybe if you're pushing really, really high, you're going to want to put some points into vitality, but if you're pushing really, really high, you probably have more than enough Paragon. For offense, everything is quite good. I might prioritize crit damage and crit chance. You could also prioritize cooldown reduction. Attack speed is definitely by far the least important thing here. So whichever of these three you feel like is doing the most work for you, try them out. I would probably do cooldown reduction. It'll make things a lot more comfortable. It'll make you actually learn the build the way it's meant to be played, as opposed to having this weird situation where you have way less CDR than you're going to in a few hundred Paragon levels. But if you feel like you'd rather have the extra damage, feel free to do that. Now for defense, these three are all very good. I generally lean towards armor and resist all before life because you're relying a lot on healing with this build, and life, of course, makes it harder to heal, whereas armor and resist all do not. But I'm not going to give you a clear priority list on which one to take. Just look at whichever one gives you more toughness on your sheet. So for example, in my case, what do we have? So we got 10 million. Armor appears to bring me to 13 million. Whereas resist all appears to bring me to, well, about the same, so whatever, right? Just take whichever gives you more. And finally, for utility, almost everyone will recommend you start with area damage and then maybe go resource cost reduction. Honestly, I would probably recommend you instead you start with life per hit. It is a really nice survivability bonus, and area damage, once you get into higher GRs, once you're putting a lot of effort into actually grouping up enemies, it starts being really nice. It starts doing a lot of damage, but it actually doesn't do very much damage when you're just doing what I did, running around, killing trash as it comes, not putting any effort into grouping guys up. So even though most builds are going to say start with area damage, I would ignore them. I would do it third. Resource cost reduction, as you probably saw, is not actually that big of a deal. Pretty much when I was casting Provoke, I had Wrath. When I wasn't casting Provoke, I didn't have Wrath. Resource cost reduction isn't going to change that much. So you can take it either second or third. Gold Find, of course, is pretty much useless, so take that last. If you really want, when you're running T13s, you could swap something out for Gold Find, but that's way too much effort, honestly. Okay, let's try something a little bit harder so you can see the build running maybe a GR80. I don't want to go too much higher than GR80 because I'm still pretty new to this build. I mostly play Blessed Shield. But let's see how it changes when enemies are about 4 times as strong. Now you probably saw my life went to almost 0 pretty much instantly. I managed to survive just fine because that's pretty much just how this build works. You spend a lot of time going up and down, but it looks really scary and takes getting used to in hardcore. You just got to be a little bit more careful, mind your buffs, and if you proc in hardcore, just get out of there, but do not panic. Now I'm going to cast Iron Skin occasionally if I get in the middle of a big pile of bad guys. It'll really decrease your damage taken. It doesn't actually show up on your sheet for some reason, but it is a massive bonus. This is getting really sketchy here. Missile dampening can be a huge problem for this build because it pretty much prevents you from hitting anything other than the guy who has missile dampening, and you have to get right beside him to do it, which can get difficult if there's all these damage affixes like there are right now. At really high GRs, you should probably just skip them. At this level, you still kill them fast enough that you can just suck it up and deal with it. You'll notice every once in a while I forget to cast Provoke, and then I have some Wrath issues. I shouldn't be having those, that's just a matter of not having played the build in a while. Now in that case I had to use Falling Sword just to get around, so I need to cast that pretty much instantly again because I'm not doing any damage without my Hammer Jammers and my Faithful Memory up. If you feel like you're not doing any damage with this build, probably you're not managing Falling Sword correctly. This build does absolutely insane damage when your buffs are up, and it does almost no damage when they're down, so just watch out for that. Now I find most builds, at least for Crusader, actually the damage gets really bad long before the toughness does. I get to the point where I'm still surviving just fine in like a GR 90, GR 100, but I'm just having trouble killing guys fast enough. This build is mostly the opposite. You'll notice we went up to 4 times health, and it's not really taking much longer to kill enemies. But we have to be a lot more careful. We have to start dodging out if things get sketchy because there's damage being taken. So I just procced. I don't want to panic. I've got Akarat's champion up so I can afford to die again. Oh, now it's time to get out of here. Now I really should have been managing my faithful or my falling swords properly, but I didn't because I was talking. So hopefully you won't be making that same mistake when you play. One of the easiest ways to die in hardcore is to get excited when you don't see any more enemies. Start a town portal, and then have a Lukunai or something drop on you. Make sure there's actually nothing around before you try and get out. I'm relatively safe right here. It's just a few whites. They don't do a lot of damage. I'm making sure to keep my buffs up, so. Okay, in this case, I think I'll just stay in the rift. It's only 9 seconds left, so. Just not going to re-engage up until it's off. Okay, let's get back in. As you play more and more and more, you get more intuition for what kind of enemies really, really hurt, what kind of enemies need to be avoided, which directions on the maps are not likely to be dead ends. That's just going to take practice. I wouldn't recommend trying to read about it or anything. Just play and you start to get a feel for what kind of enemies like Punishers really hurt and what kind of enemies you really don't have to care about. I actually just changed my keybind setup recently, so I keep trying to cast Falling Sword and end up casting Provoke instead. Shield is nice to have. I find it doesn't really change my clear times all that much, but it means I can be lazy for a minute, which is always nice in hardcore. Notice how low my damage went when I lost my Falling Sword buffs. At this point I'm at 99%, so I'm just trying to finish off the rift. Usually hunting for density at this point is just going to cost you time. So this Rift Guardian is still dying pretty fast, but if it was much slower than this, I would probably see about switching to Bane of the Stricken. This is where it starts to get on the annoying end. Summoning Rift Guardians are also really nice for this build since you can get your full Faithful Memory stacks, and as you just saw, that made a massive difference in my damage. Okay, so I think I'm going to do one more run. This one will maybe be a GR60, and I'll show you how to really speedrun with this thing. This is absolutely not the best speedrunning build, but given this is a Hammerdin guide, let's do some Hammerdin speedrunning. So as I mentioned, we're going to want to swap this out for Laws of Hope, Wings of Angels, this out for Steed Charge Endurance, and this is just going to allow us to clear through content way faster. Now in this case, you don't have to be too careful about who you end up hitting with Hammer Jammers, because everyone pretty much dies instantly. As long as you have one of the two up, and honestly, on this trash, I don't even seem to need either to kill them really quickly. Usually, I end up mostly elite hunting when I'm speed farming because it just takes too much time to gather up trash. The killing them just isn't worth it in the same way that it is on higher difficulties. So we're just going to look for orbs, throw a few hammers as we pass trash to kill some of the more dense packs, but really, like these guys, I don't care about them. I might kill them if this was GR80, but not on GR60. Now you'll notice you can also be really lazy with your buffs, which is nice. I mean, especially for hardcore players, if you just want to watch Netflix or something. I wouldn't recommend this build for watching Netflix, but on something like a GR60 with the gear I've got right now, it's quite safe. I'm not even bothering to recast Faith Falling Sword, honestly, right now. It's just completely unnecessary. I've actually been forgetting to use Steed Charge most of the time, so I could be going through here significantly faster, but we're still making very good time. This is enough guys that it's worth killing. As I mentioned, as you learn the maps, you're going to get to know dead ends when you see them. Normally I would have killed that trash pack back there, but if you've already got Steed Charge up, you might as well just keep going, honestly. There's usually only one elite pack up here, but there's nice enough density that we might as well clear some of these guys out. That would have been nice on the GR80 for the Rift Guardian, but it'll be completely unnecessary here. Okay, and that is my Secretly Light Hammerdin guide. I hope it was useful, and please let me know if you have any questions.